Okay, so let's begin our Bible study. So the 8th chapter of Ecclesiastes deals with some questions that many a sage, many a wise man has tried to figure out. And Solomon really doesn't give us a lot of answers other than just turn to God. God is the answer. He is the one that if we place our faith in him, that it will conquer all fear. And so keep that in mind, that Solomon is still striving to find the answers to the questions that have plagued him all of his life. You know, as soon as Solomon received this divine measure of faith, he started contemplating and thinking about everything that had to do with life and even the afterlife. And that there's some things, as Deuteronomy 29:29 says, that are secret, and the secret things belong to God. So there's some things that even the wisest man at that time didn't know. And that frustrated Solomon to no end. And you're going to feel that frustration in this chapter. He is making, if you will, this crossover from the days of his folly, the days of his youth, and where he was trying to please himself and no one else. Now he's making this crossover to, you know, I need to accept what it is or what is. I need to just allow God to take control of my life and place my faith in him, and that will quell my fear. So the 8th chapter is that crossover to that thought process or lifestyle that Solomon needs to embrace and ultimately seems to have embraced. So he presents to us a series of mysteries, a series of questions that can't be answered. And, you know, what I have on the screen aren't Solomon's questions, but it's just some questions to get us thinking. It's a primer to get us thinking in the right context. For example, whose cruel idea was it for the word lisp to have an S in it? We can figure that one out. And why do you press hard on a remote control when you know the battery is dead? Or why does sour cream have an expiration date if it's already sour? Why is a carrot more orange than an orange? Again, these are silly questions. These are just things that we wonder, like why do we drive on a parkway? Why do we Why do we park in a driveway and drive in a parkway? You know, those are questions that are just silly. But the questions that Solomon asks is based on the idea that maybe God's not fair. That maybe God is just playing with humanity like a schoolyard bully with a magnifying glass burning the ants. And this is the feeling that we're going to get from reading Ecclesiastes chapter 8. Look at verse 17, Ecclesiastes 8 and verse 17. And I saw every work of God, and I concluded, after he thought about all these things that we're going to talk about in the 8th chapter, he says, I concluded that man cannot discover the work which has been done under the sun. And this is exactly what Solomon wanted to do. This is what he set out to do. If you remember Ecclesiastes 1 and 2 as well, that he set out himself to find the answer to everything. And he says, you know, I finally came to the conclusion that man cannot discover the work which has been done under the sun. Even though man should seek laboriously, he will not discover. And though the wise man should say, I know, he just cannot discover. And I think that many of us at times get into the problem of wanting to know what God has not revealed to us. And we should be careful. But Solomon, his mysteries have to do with why do the righteous go punished in his eyes and the unrighteous go unpunished? Or to say it a different way, Solomon is wondering, why is there so much evil and destruction in this world? And if you look around, if you've made the mistake of watching the news, then you know that we are living during a very depressing time. I suggest to you, turn off the TV, don't read the news feeds, because we're receiving a lot of negative information. That doesn't mean put your head in the sand and not be aware of what's going around you. But I'm saying don't allow anyone or anything to cause your faith to wane, to cause your faith to tremble and shake some. This is why Solomon says, look, I saw every work of God, and I concluded that man just cannot make heads or tails of everything in this world. Even though man should seek laboriously, he will not discover. And though the wise man should say, I know, he cannot discover. So Solomon introduces this chapter by addressing leadership or addressing authority. And I think that most people, unless you have a very submissive personality, a very submissive attitude, most people don't like to be told what to do. I know with my 3 girls, 6, 4, and 1, even that 1-year-old, when I tell her to do something, she will respond with a huh, which means no. Not even children appreciate the authority like it should be appreciated. And Solomon is going to talk about leadership. You know, he is the king. He was accustomed to people bowing down to him and obeying him and doing what he said. So he begins this way. Who is like the wise man, and who knows the interpretation of a matter? A man's wisdom illumines him and causes his stern face to beam. I say, keep the command of the king because of the oath before God. Do not be in a hurry to leave him. Do not join in an evil matter, for he will do whatever he pleases. And notice that the word he there is not capitalized, so it's talking about the king. And it goes on to say in verse 4, since the word of the king is authoritative, that is, it's a final answer, who will say to him, what are you doing? He who keeps a royal command experiences no trouble, for a wise heart knows the proper time and procedure. In other words, who's going to question the king? Who's going to question our rulers, our people in authority? Now, he's not saying never question. He's saying be smart. See, a wise heart knows how and when to ask the question. How? With the proper attitude, with the proper respect and the proper reverence. And when? You see, what do you think would have happened to one of the king's advisors had he questioned the king in the presence of all his subjects? He'd probably have killed him. Now, does that mean that the question that he was going to ask was wrong? No. But he did it at the wrong time in the wrong way. So this is why he says, he who keeps a royal command is not going to be in trouble. A wise person knows the when and how and where to ask the question or to question the king. For there is a proper time and procedure for every delight, though a man's trouble is heavy upon him. For if no one knows what will happen, who can tell him when it will happen? No man has authority to restrain the wind with the wind, or authority over the day of death, and there is no discharge in the time of war, and evil will not deliver those who practice it. So, and basically what he's saying here is that not even the king can change the date of our death. He can't change our expiration date. Not even the king can control the hurricane and the tornado. Can't do that. And not even during the war can a soldier say, I don't want to go to war, so I want to be discharged. No, you won't be discharged. You'll probably be placed in the front line. So no man has authority to restrain the wind with the wind, or authority over the day of death, and there is no discharge in the time of war, and evil will not deliver those who practice it. All this I have seen and applied my mind to every deed that has been done under the sun, wherein a man has exercised authority over another man to his hurt. We'll see what that means here shortly. So here are the two questions that are asked in verse 1. Who is wise and who has vision. Only the wise know, is what Solomon is saying, I believe. Only the wise know what things really mean. In other words, the wise is going to speak less and think more. The wise is going to meditate upon God's word. The wise person is going to analyze everything to be able to understand the meaning instead of just opening your mouth and talking immediately without thinking. But in reference to leaders, only wise leaders have a vision. During every presidential campaign in our country, we have candidates that will tell us what their plan is, what their plan to eradicate poverty or to better the economy or to stop wars or whatever. They all have a plan because they're trying to approach us from the standpoint that they have a vision that is better than their opponent. Well, Solomon is teaching us here that good leaders, leaders with wisdom, have a vision, because how can you lead a country without vision if you don't know where you're going? One of the first things I learned when I was going to school to become a teacher was that called lesson planning. And my professor pointed out that, lesson planning, teaching is like making a trip. If you want to know where you're headed, you have to have a map and see where your destination is. And then you look at the map to plan your way how to get to that destination. Well, the same thing with teaching. What is it I want to accomplish? Now I have to plan and plot the path to get to that goal. Well, Solomon is saying the same thing. Where do you want to lead your country? Where do you want to lead your people? You have to have a vision to lead your people. Now, let's bring it to a more practical context. Our home. You are the father and the mother, the heads of the household. Do you have a vision for your family? Or do you live by the seat of your pants? And we know what happens whenever we fail to plan in our family. If we don't plan financially for that rainy day, when that rainy day comes, or as Dave Ramsey says, when Murphy comes, then what are we going to do? Are we going to depend on someone or some organization or some government to bail us out? Or should we have planned? Should we have had a vision where we planned to be able to survive that disaster? Same thing with the church. One of the qualifications for the elders is that they rule their household well. They have to be good leaders in their home. If their family is willing to trust and follow them, then the church will be willing to do the same. But a man that is not able to lead his family and is not able to command the respect of his family, then he won't be able to be a leader in the church either. You see, this is what Solomon is saying. The one that is wise is going to look for vision to be able to present that vision to those who are his subjects. Proverbs 29, verse 18, where there is no vision, the people are unrestrained, but happy is he who keeps the law. This passage can be applied on two realms, two levels. Let's look at the heavenly level. Let's say the law here is talking about the law of God. What's the purpose for God's law? Is it just so that we can know who's in control, who's in charge? Or is it for our own well-being? That's the law. That's why the law is there, to help us live a healthy, productive, and peaceful life on this earth. Look at the 10 Commandments. You shall have no other God before me. Why? Because when we have other gods, that is ourselves, our family, our jobs, or anything that's material, then we won't be looking to God as our only lawgiver and follow him and his vision, but we'll be doing or following our own vision. And if everybody follows their own path, lives their own life, their own way without any law and order, well, then it's going to be a mess. Now let's talk about the physical level. If there are no laws on this in our nation, in our city, then, I was thinking today as I was coming down through Hueytown, I've had a driver's license in Texas, Kentucky, Indiana, and now in Alabama. And I come to find out that some traffic laws in Alabama are totally different than traffic laws in the other 3 states who have had a driver's license. And I've been so frustrated because I've been seeing people in my mind with what I've been trained that are violating, breaking traffic laws. But then doing some investigations, no, they're not breaking the traffic laws. I'm breaking the traffic laws. And we have traffic laws for what purpose? So that there won't be chaos on the streets. So the writer here in Proverbs 29, verse 18 is saying you have to have a vision. The same thing applies to the church. If there's no vision for the church, then the church is just going to exist. And eventually the people are going to get older and die out, and the church will be gone in that community. Church has to have vision. Vision that is within God's word, by the way. Proverbs 30 and verse 2, surely I am more stupid than any man, and I do not have the understanding of a man. What do you think he might be saying here? That I am more stupid than any man. I don't have the understanding of a man. Again, when we look beneath the sun for wisdom, we're going to always fall short. Neither have I learned wisdom, nor do I have the knowledge of the Holy One, because the knowledge and the wisdom that we're talking about here, that Solomon is talking about, comes from God. The wisdom that Solomon possessed came from God. The wisdom that Solomon embraced was his own. And that's why he was suffering emotionally by the time we get to Ecclesiastes chapter 8. But there, in the second part of verse 1, there's this comment that Solomon makes when he says, a man's wisdom illumes or brightens him and causes his stern face to beam. Well, there are a couple of things, or a couple of ways we can understand this. And I'm not saying that either one is absolutely correct. It's open to interpretation. But one is that a friendly smile goes a long way. Now, if we're talking about the king, when the king is going to give an edict to the people, for example, the king says that you're going to pay 20% of your income as a tax. And he says that you're going to do it whether you like it or not. What do you think is going to be the reaction of the majority of people? We don't like it. And they're not going to do it willingly. They're going to try to hide it, try to steal, right? But if the king comes and presents the idea to the people, we have this debt, this poverty, these our military is depleted, whatever, and then explains to them, in order to be able to be self-sustaining and be where we need to be as a society and as a nation, we need to pay more in taxes. Then that friendly smile ingratiates the people to follow the leader. See, great leaders understand people. One of the biggest mistakes that any leader, whether it be a mayor, a governor, a president, or prime minister, the biggest mistake that person can make is forgetting that he is one of the people. And many times, the president or whomever it might be in authority thinks of himself to be greater, better, more important than the people that he is governing. Same thing happens with the father in the household. To be the head of the house, as we read in the New Testament, is not a right. It is a charge that God has given to the head of the house. And it is a responsibility that he's given us. And we need to carry out that responsibility with love. And that's why he says in Ephesians that we need to treat the wives how? With proper understanding, with respect, like a very fragile glass. And then that fathers, don't provoke your children to wrath, which means don't forget that you at one time were a child. And that you didn't like it when your father beat you. You didn't like it when your father just had a heavy-handed fist and controlled you just because he could. No. you need to remember where you came from. If you want to be respected, you have to earn that respect, and you earn respect by showing respect to others. The leader of a government, the leader of a church, the leader in the family that forgets where he came from and forgets that he's dealing with people that have the same shortcomings as he does or she does will fail to gain the respect of the people. And the people might do what he or she says, but not out of respect. 1 Thessalonians chapter 2 and verse 11. Just as you know how we are exhorting and encouraging and imploring each one of you as a father would his own son. And I cite this passage to point out that children will respect their father and their mother when they're disciplined if it's done in a fair way, if there's justice to be served. You know, if I get a ticket from the policeman because I'm going over the speed limit, I should be willing to say, I respect you for your job. I respect what you're doing. You're trying to keep law and order. But if the policeman gives me a ticket when I wasn't speeding just because he can, then I'm not going to respect authority. And that's why I cite 1 Thessalonians 2 and verse 11, that discipline is necessary in the family, in the church, in the government. It's necessary when it's fair. When it's not fair, you'll have what we see on the streets right now. Rebellion and protest and all kinds of behavior that is not conducive to peace. Another quality of a good leader is that they keep their word. Now, there's 2 points or 2 pieces to this statement that Solomon makes. First of all, if you read the scripture with me in verse 2, keep the command to the king. Why? Why should we keep the command of the king? Because of the oath before God. Now, this could be talking about the oath that the king made to faithfully execute, right? To faithfully lead his people. Or it could mean what Romans 13 says, right? Render unto Caesar what is Caesar, and to God what is God. What Paul says in Romans 13, that we need to obey the laws of the land, that the leaders that we have been placed there by God, whether we like what it says or not. That's not the point. That's what it says, Romans 13. So if on one hand, the leaders that exist, the authorities that exist have been put in there in that place by God or allowed to exist, then we need to submit to God's will and submit to those leaders. Second of all, the leaders, they took an oath. They vowed. In this case, Solomon says, in the name of God. And if the leaders vowed to be good, honest, reputable, fair-minded, righteous leaders, then they need to keep their word. You know, how many times have we questioned politicians? When it's the political season, they make all these grandiose promises. I remember one presidential candidate that became president in the 60s that was promising that he and his administration and his tenure in office would completely eradicate poverty. Well, what did Jesus say? The poor you will always have among you. So there's no way that we can eradicate poverty completely. But that was a promise that was made, and he failed. Not that he didn't try, but he failed. If you want your citizens, if you want people that you are in charge of in the home, in the church, or in the government, or in your business to respect you, then you have to keep your word. And then we, in turn, Romans 13, must also submit to our fathers, our mothers, our employers, right? Our leaders in political office. We're supposed, because of the oath that was made before God. Verse 2, keep the command of the king because of the oath before God. Another good quality of a great leader is that great leaders know when to do and when not to do. Now, look at verse 5. Ecclesiastes 8, verse 5, he who keeps a royal command experiences no trouble, for a wise heart knows a proper time and procedure. Again, a good leader is going to have enough wisdom, enough insight to be able to know when it's right to act, when it's the right time to say, to speak, and when it's the right time to be quiet. Abraham Lincoln, when he won the presidency, when he became president, he put into his administration all those people that were running against him, all of his opponents, people that criticized him, people that called him crazy, people that said that he would be a disaster. He put in his administration as his advisors people that disagreed with them. If you are a wise and good leader, you won't have a problem with disagreements. You won't have a problem with being challenged in how you're thinking, because you're wise. You'll listen to all the points of view before you make a decision. And your decision might be contrary to what all your advisors are saying, but still you've listened, given pause, and thought things through. Great leaders know when to act. And in times of disaster, a good leader will be able to convince people to keep the faith. Will be able to convince people that it's going to be okay, because he's going to somehow, because of who he is and how he's treated his people and his oath to God, he's going to be able to direct and guide the people on that right path. Now, I'm thinking about Moses. Moses was never, God never claims that Moses was a perfect man. We know that he sinned, right? That's why he didn't make it to the promised land. But other than when he beat the rock with the rod, other than that time, whenever the people of God began to complain and to grumble and mumble and kick their feet and just be miserable, I mean, even to the point of saying, we wish God had never taken us out of Egypt. We wish he had left us as slaves. Even during all those times, Moses, because he was a great leader, was able to do a few things that helped him as a leader. One, he always turned to God. He always turned to God. When the people were complaining, when they were at the edge of the Red Sea, and they said, why did you bring us out of Egypt to be killed here at the edge of the sea? You should have just left us back in Egypt and would be at peace. What does Moses do? God, your people are complaining. What do I do? When they complained about not enough food, and that they were used to eating a whole variety of meats in Egypt, and now in the desert they have nothing but that miserable bread that comes down from heaven. And Paul tells us in the Corinthians that bread was who? Jesus, right? So Moses intercedes and as a good leader talks to God, and God sends in meat, a lot of meat, by the way. When they were complaining about not having leeks and cucumbers and all the spices that they were used to having, God would make sure that they had all those provisions. But it was Moses who, as a leader, was able to maintain the peace. And when there was time for punishment, he, as a good father, made sure that that punishment was carried out. But it had to be fair, it had to be righteous, and it had to be swift. Something else that Solomon deals with in this chapter: swift punishment or swift justice. But a good leader will know how to act in times of disaster and will be able to rally the support of his people and encourage them. A good leader, a good king will be able to help his people mourn when there's a national disaster. A good father, a good mother will be able to kiss the boo-boo of your children, if you will be able to make them feel like it's all better. Why? Because they're depending upon not the wisdom of man, not the wisdom of Dr. Spock, for those of you old enough to know who he was or is, if he's still alive, but the wisdom of God. Proverbs 27, verse 1. God's wisdom says, do not boast about tomorrow, For you do not know what a day may bring forth. God's wisdom says, don't worry about the things that you can't stop, slow down, or change. Now, we might, as we read this passage, we might immediately think, well, God's talking about, don't be worried about making plans. Maybe so. But I think that there's more to this passage. And as we'll read in the book of James here in the next verse, I think that the proverb is actually saying this. There are things in your life that you can control. Therefore, control them. There are things in life that you cannot control. Don't waste time and energy trying to control, change, or stop what you can't control. Because if you waste your time and your energy in trying to stop, to change, or control what's out of your control, then you're reaching for the wisdom not from above, but man's wisdom. Later on, Solomon's going to say, I'm so tired. I'm so wearied. I'm so frustrated of trying to figure all this out that I think the conclusion is this: eat, drink, and be merry. Enjoy life. James 4, come now, verse 13. You who say today or tomorrow we will go to such and such a city and spend a year there and engage in business and make a profit. Yet you don't even know what your life is going to be like tomorrow. You are just a vapor that appears for a little while and then vanishes away. It's a young lady that she just graduated high school, top honors, full ride scholarship to Harvard. And today she was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. It's so debilitating, isn't it? But this is why I think these studies in God's word are so important. That while we as feeble humans try to make sense out of life, that many times we're going to try to make sense of things that we can't make sense of. Deuteronomy 29, the secret things belong to God. So what should we be concerned about? The things that we can control. Verse 15, instead you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and also do this or that. But as it is, you boast in your arrogance, and all such boasting is evil. What's the boasting that he's talking about? That you can control the uncontrollable. That you can get on God's end of the business and do it for him. Or tell God how to do things. That boasting is arrogance, and that boasting is evil. Therefore, to one who knows the right thing to do and does not do it, to him it is sin. What is he talking about in verse 17? To him who knows to do the right thing, doesn't do it, it's a sin. Many times we use this passage way out of context, right? We'll say that the Christian that's traveling from one city to the next and happens to find himself in the town on a Wednesday night, and that church there's having a Bible study, and they don't go to church. They know that the right thing to do is to go to church, and they don't do it. It's a sin because James 4:17 says that. Well, that's not what James 4:17 is teaching. Yeah, we ought to go to church, right? We ought to meet with the saints in the local area. But what he's teaching here, follow the context. Boasting in that we can control what cannot be controlled by man. Boasting in that we are in charge of what tomorrow holds, and we're not. That is what the sin is talking about here. Another great quality of a quality of a great leader is that great leaders remain humble. Never forget where you came from. Never forget that the people elected you and placed you in that position. Power and money can never control the wind. Read there in verse 8, in Ecclesiastes 8 and verse 8. No man has authority to restrain the wind with the wind, or authority over the day of death, and there is no discharge in the time of war, and evil will not deliver those who practice it. All this I have seen and applied my mind to every deed that has been done under the sun, wherein a man has exercised authority over another man to his hurt. You see, it doesn't matter if you have the entire U.S. military at your disposal, you still can't control a hurricane, can you? You still can't control a tornado. There's things that money and power cannot change or buy. Solomon recognizes that that type of power comes only from God, not man. And then verse 9, he talks about, there in verse 9, all this I have seen and applied my mind to every deed that has been done under the sun, wherein a man has exercised authority over another man to his hurt. Friends, I don't want to agitate or add any salt to the wound, but we're seeing in our own country what abuse of power does. Solomon is saying, you've been given this charge by God under oath that you will exercise the office of your responsibility with fairness, with justice, with humility. Never abuse your power. As a father, it would be extremely easy for me to I'm not looking for the word abuse. It'd be very easy for me to, I'll use the word abuse. For me to abuse my authority over my children and make them do things or deprive them of doing things just because I can with no rhyme or reason. That's abusing my power, my authority as a parent. An eldership of a church has the authority only to make decisions that are in the best interest of the functioning of the church. In other words, of worship, the time, the purchasing of a building. But an eldership does not have the authority to legislate where God has already legislated. In other words, leadership in churches, pastors cannot change God's word. But many have tried. A king should never abuse his power. An eldership should never abuse their power or authority. A father, an employer, anyone in leadership should always remain humble. That just as God has allowed them to be placed in that position, God can now also allow them to be removed from that position. And this is why when you look at the emperors of Rome, their own family killed them. Their own mothers and sisters and brothers killed the emperor because they abused their power. They got to thinking that they were God and that their word was last or final. And they got knocked out by their own family. Then Solomon seems to make a sort of transition here in the last half of the chapter, when he addresses this idea of why does God allow bad things to happen to good people? I read a story recently of a great tragedy where a mother decided to take the lives of her children, little babies, kill them, and then she killed herself. Why did that happen? And many of people have seen disaster after disaster in their lifetime without having any spiritual foundation and are convinced there is no God. And if there is a God, then why does he allow these terrible things to happen to good people? You see, faith, according to Hebrews chapter 1, is trust. And we are to trust in God in the good times and the bad times. Isn't that what Job said to his friends, to his wife? When everything was going great, when we had children, when we had, livestock and houses, we had servants, man, thank you, God, for all of these good things that we have. And now that we've lost everything, oh, it's God's fault. Job says we need to receive the blessings from God with thanksgiving, as well as this calamity with thanksgiving. To God be the glory. That is faith in God in times of disaster. We can't just be faithful to God and love God and appreciate God and worship God when he gives us everything that we want. That wouldn't be a fair God, would it? So Solomon is going to try to plant the seed in our heads about things aren't fair. But then he never gives us the answer, but at least he gives us an alternative. The prophet Isaiah says in Isaiah 55, verse 8, in reference to God, where God says, my thoughts are not your thoughts. You see, if God had a human mind, then everything would make sense in our lives. But God says, your ways are not my ways. I'm going to suggest that you look at this passage from a different perspective. My middle daughter came to me the other day, and she had in her mind a list of about 4 or 5 demands, things that she was going to tell me, or things that she was telling me that I was going to do. I mean, I had no choice in the matter. She was telling me, you're going to do this, 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 and that. One of them involved in me painting my fingernails and toenails. The other involved me cutting my hair, letting her cut my hair with some clippers. The other one, no. She was adamant that I was going to do what she said. God is telling us this. I am the creator. You are the created. I am the potter. You're the clay. The created has no right to tell the creator how to run the show. The clay has no right to tell the potter how to fashion it and what object to make it. And God is telling us in Isaiah 55, verses 8 through 9, my thoughts are so much supreme than yours. You see what you can see right here. As far as your nose goes, that's as far as you can see. God sees from eternity present, or from eternity to eternity. He sees the whole picture. God doesn't want us as his counselors. He wants us as his faithful children. Verse 10 in Ecclesiastes 8 and verse 10. So then, he says, I've seen the wicked buried, and those who used to go in and out from the holy place, and they're soon forgotten in the city where they did thus. This too is futility. So he says, I've seen it. Righteous people that go to church, right? Going to the holy places. They went and came, offered their sacrifices, paid their tithe, kept all the festivals. They did all these things. They died, and now no one remembers them. He says this is futility. Because a sentence against an evil deed is not executed quickly, therefore the hearts of the sons of men among them are given fully to do evil. So he's asking, in a roundabout way, why do we give the death sentence to a criminal, but wait 50 years before that death sentence is carried out? What's the purpose? Romans 13, what's the purpose of a law with teeth? To be able to dissuade people from doing or committing crimes. The sentence against an evil deed is not executed quickly. Therefore, the hearts of the sons of men among them are given fully to evil, because they think since they're not punished for what they do immediately, other people think, oh, well, I can break this law. I can murder. I can commit adultery. I can do all these things because, he got away with it. That means that I'll get away with it. 1 Corinthians chapter 5. 1 Corinthians chapter 5. We have an example of the Corinthian church tolerating sin. This is the church. This is at the church level. You know, Ecclesiastes 8 is talking about the national level. I'm talking about the church level in 1 Corinthians 5. He says that the church there had a case of an adultery that not even the unfaithful, not even the Gentiles committed this type of sin. It was that a boy had fallen in love with the stepmama and was having a sexual relationship with the stepmama. And the church at Corinth knew that there was this sin going on, and they didn't say or do anything about it. There's a person in this whole mess of 1 Corinthians 5 that's innocent, and that's the husband. And he's not receiving justice. It's not fair because the church there at Corinth is tolerating that sin. What does Paul say? You can't do that. You can't put up with that type of sin. You cannot have members in the church that are in fornication, in adultery. You cannot have members of the church that are in sin without discipline, because then that little bit of leaven is going to do what? Leaven the entire lump and make people think we can live in sin and get away with it. No, Paul says you need to put that man out of your presence. Discipline him. Turn him over to Satan for the destruction of his flesh, so that that man can mourn and say, look, I enjoyed fellowship with the church. I love going to church. I love being with my Christian brethren. But because of my sin, I'm not allowed to do that anymore. So I must give up my sin so that I can be back in that fellowship. And that's what Paul is saying in 1 Corinthians chapter 5. And this is what Solomon is saying in Ecclesiastes 8 and verse 11. You know, it's not fair that people commit crimes are not punished quickly. Verse 12, although a sinner does evil 100 times and may lengthen his life, still I know that it will be well for those who fear God, who fear him openly. But it will not be well for the evil man, and he will not lengthen his days like a shadow, because he does not fear God. There is futility which is done on the earth. That is, there are righteous men to whom it happens according to the deeds of the wicked. On the other hand, there are evil men to whom it happens according to the deeds of the righteous. I say this too is futility. So I commended pleasure, for there is nothing good for a man under the sun except to eat and to drink and to be merry, and this will stand by him in his toils throughout the days of his life, which God has given him under the sun. So here, as I have on this on the screen, here lies in this casket. That was verse 14, I believe, or 13. Here lies a low-down, good-for-nothing scumbag in the casket. And the preacher gets up to give a eulogy. The word eulogy, by the way, if you look it up, means good. Good. G-O-O-D, good. So when you eulogize someone in life or in death, you're going to talk about all the good things that they've done. So here lies a low-down, good-for-nothing scumbag that was a liar, cheater, thief, murderer, whatever. And the preacher gets up there and says all the wonderful things about this man, and that he's looking down to us from heaven, and that he's up there with Abraham, and he's up there with Jesus, he's up there with all the angels singing praises. He's been given his wings and a harp. You've never heard a eulogy that truly describes the low-down, good-for-nothing scumbag, have you? When I lived in Indiana, one of the funeral homes, or two of the funeral homes, had me on the list to call me so I could officiate funerals for people that didn't have a religion or a church. And there was one call of a man that he had died and didn't have a church, didn't have a religion, but his family wanted a Christian wedding for him. I mean, a Christian funeral for him, burial. So I went and met with this wife. And I said, what can you tell me about your husband? And she basically said he was a good, low-down, good-for-nothing scumbag. He beat her. He abused her. So then I went to his two children and asked him, what can you tell me about your daddy? Well, he sexually abused us. Everyone I spoke with had nothing nice to say about the man. So the day of the funeral, I go up there and I read his obituary, and then I sit down. And the funeral director says, hey, how about the eulogy? I said, I don't think you want me to say what his family said about him. Let's just leave it at that. Solomon is saying, how is it that the unrighteous, listen to this, the unrighteous get a good funeral? How's that fair? That's a mystery that he says, why do people do that? And then in verse 11, what we talked about a while ago, that delayed punishment when you break the law, Solomon is saying, why do governments allow the wicked to go unpunished? That just encourages more crime. No, every single crime needs to be punished, or else you'll have chaos. And then verses 12 and 13 is really what is the kick in the teeth, if you will. He says, in the end, the righteous, to some extent, the righteous are the ones that suffer the most. The unrighteous get all the good things. He says, shouldn't it be the other way around? I mean, it doesn't make sense that God is going to allow an unrighteous steward or an unrighteous man, woman, to have all the blessings of this world, to be wealthy, to have health, to have food. And then the righteous is going to be poor, is going to suffer, he says, just that's not fair. I mean, that's one of those unsolved mysteries, right? Well, Jesus in Matthew chapter 5 talks to us about that, and he says, you're worried about the unrighteous receiving the good things and the righteous receiving the bad things. Jesus says on the Sermon on the Mount, blessed are the poor in spirit, right? Blessed are those that hunger and thirst for righteousness. Blessed, he's talking to those that receive the short end of the stick, if you will, the fuzzy end of the lollipop. He says, you'll be blessed. You'll be taken care of. There is a reward for you. Don't worry about what you can't change. So Solomon says in Ecclesiastes 3, in talking about the same thing, verse 14, he says, I know that everything God does is going to stand forever. There's nothing to add to it, and there's nothing to take from it. For God has so worked that men should fear him. So what's Solomon's advice in this verse? Look at the last line, that man should fear God. Either in this lifetime or in the life to come in eternity, everyone will obey God, whether you like it or not. This is why I reference, or this is something I reference whenever I preach about submitting yourself before the mighty hand of God. Humble yourself before the mighty hand of God. I say this, you either do it willingly and enjoy the blessings of God, or he'll force you one day to bow before him, and you're not going to like it that way. So humble yourself willingly and not by force. I know that everything God does is going to remain forever. I can't change that, is what Solomon says. I can't change the direction of the wind. I can't change that natural disaster that's coming from the ocean. I can't change the tornado. I can't stop death from happening. I know that God has put things in place, and they are in place, and I cannot change them. I cannot add to it. I cannot take away from it, because God has worked it. Because man cannot do those things, because man cannot control those things, man will then fear God, respect God as who he is. Ecclesiastes 5 and verse 7. For in many dreams and in many words there is emptiness. Rather, just fear God. You can plan for the future. You can daydream all you want. But in the end, what God has already ordained is going to happen. And I'm not talking about every minute aspect of our lives. I'm talking about the day of your birth and the day of your death. Who can stop it? So instead of us trying to stop those things or prevent those things from happening, just learn to trust in God. Chapter 7 of Ecclesiastes, verse 18, it is good that you grasp one thing and also not let go of the other. For the one who fears God comes forth with both of them. Grasping at both ends of the string, and Solomon is saying, you're worried too much. If you look at verse 17 of Ecclesiastes 7, verse 17, he said, do not be excessively wicked and do not be a fool. Why should you die before your time? Use some wisdom. It's good that you grasp one thing and also not let go of the other. Don't let go of God. At the same time, if you trust God, if you obey God, if you submit to him, you'll be able to enjoy life. You'll be able to enjoy everything else that God gives us. For the one who fears God comes forth with both of them. Verse 14. He builds on this question of why do bad things happen to good people? And why do good things happen to bad people? Right? Read that verse with me there in Ecclesiastes chapter 8 and verse 14. He says, there is futility which is done on the earth, that is, there are righteous men to whom it happens according to the deeds of the wicked. On the other hand, there are evil men to whom it happens according to the deeds of the righteous. I say that this too is futility. What is futility? What is he saying is futility? That things happen or trying to figure it out? I think that's what he's trying. I think that's what the futility is, in trying to figure out the mind of God. Again, my favorite passage in this chapter is Deuteronomy 29, verse 29. What we know, then act on that. What we don't know, then give it up. Let God take care of it. So his question is quite valid to a certain extent. And I think many people, I often think this. Why do the righteous suffer and the wicked go unpunished? Why can a leader lie, cheat, steal, embezzle, and bribe and get away with it? But if you and I do it, we'll end up in jail, maybe in prison for the rest of our lives. It's just not fair, is it? Is it God's fault? Or is it the fault of the sinful world that we live in? So then Solomon says, look, I'm tired of trying to figure all this out. I spent my entire lifetime trying to figure this out. And this is what the conclusion I've come to. First of all, you need to fear God. Secondly, why don't you just enjoy your life? I mean, if you live a righteous, if you live a life that's dedicated to the Lord, always trying to do what his will says for you to do, you'll have a very enjoyable life. But if you have selfish ambition and you have all these desires of the flesh, you won't be able to enjoy life. If you're always thinking about the things that you can't change, you won't enjoy life. If you're always thinking about the wrongs that have been done to you in the past and say, you know, if my life was fine, it was going great until this person came into my life, or until that happened, or until my baby was born dead, or until, you know, there are things that happen that we can't change after they've happened. But what you can control, what you can change, is what you're going to dwell on. How are you going to occupy your time to dwell on the simple and beautiful things that God has to offer? If not, you're going to become bitter and cynical and not trust anyone, not even God. So Solomon's advice is, eat, drink, and be merry. Now, he's not saying do all this in the absence of God or without God. Where does your food and your drink and your happiness come from? It comes from God. True happiness, true contentment, true fulfillment comes from a good and healthy relationship that man has with God. So that's what you need to worry about. Being pleasing to God and enjoying the blessings that he's given you, whether it's a lot or little. But it's more that you and I can do on our own. So let's end with some passages from Ecclesiastes. In Ecclesiastes 2, verse 24. There is nothing better for a man than to eat and drink and tell himself that his labor is good. This also I have seen, that it is from the hand of God. For who can eat and who can have enjoyment without God? Right? Even the atheist understands that their food comes from somewhere, someone, or something. Now, they might think that it comes from Mother Earth, but Solomon says you can't enjoy your food you can't have enjoyment without God in the picture, because all good things come from God. Verse 26, Ecclesiastes 2, verse 26, for to a person who is good in his sight, he has given wisdom and knowledge and joy, while to the sinner he has given the task of gathering and collecting, so that he may give to one who is good in God's sight. This too is vanity and striving after wind. Just enjoy life. Verse 12 of the 3rd chapter. I know that there is nothing better for them than to rejoice and to do good in one's lifetime. Moreover, that every man who eats and drinks sees good in all his labor. It is the gift of God. And this is contentment. I might have told you the story about this man that had been out that morning doing some fishing, and he had caught however many he wanted to catch. And he made lunch. He enjoyed some nice baked fish or roasted fish, and he was sitting underneath a shade tree and just relaxing. And here comes this businessman, and he says to the fisherman, what are you doing? He says, I'm relaxing. He said, why don't you go out and fish more? He said, why? He said, if you fish more, if you spend more time on the lake, you'll catch more fish. And if you catch more, he said, why do I want more fish? If you catch more fish, you'll be able to sell it. He said, why would I want to do that? So you can have more money. Why would I do that? So that you can have a good and happy and content life. And the fisherman said, well, I have a full belly, and I'm relaxing under the shade tree. I think my life is pretty good. And this is what Solomon is teaching us through this book. Be content and enjoy what God has given you. Verse 22, I have seen that nothing is better than that man should be happy in his activities, for that is his lot. For who will bring him to see what will occur after him? Once you're dead, you won't care what happens on this earth, is what he's saying there. So while you're alive, make the best of it. Ecclesiastes 5, verse 17, throughout his life he also eats in darkness with great vexation, sickness, and anger, because the rich man is wondering, who's going to take over my plantation when I leave? Who's going to take over my business when I leave? What are my kids going to do with all my money? That's why I tell my parents, don't leave us an inheritance, spend it all, so you won't worry what we'll do with it when you leave us. Here's what I've seen to be good and fitting: to eat, to drink, and enjoy oneself in all one's labor in which he toils under the sun, during the few years of this life which God has given him, for this is his reward. Seems like all these passages that we've been reading from Ecclesiastes, Solomon had this in mind. He had the answer. He was just too blind to see it. He gives us the advice, but he was too blind to follow his own advice. Chapter 5, verse 19, furthermore, as for every man to whom God has given riches and wealth, he has also empowered him to eat from them and to receive his reward and rejoice in his labor. This is the gift of God, for he will not often consider the years of his life, because God keeps him occupied with the gladness of his heart. So the last two passages of Ecclesiastes chapter 8, verses 16 and 17. Solomon is basically saying what Moses wrote in Deuteronomy 29:29. Accept the fact that there are some things we will never understand, no matter how much or how little we want to know the answer. There are some things we just cannot figure out. Solomon concludes by saying, when I gave my heart to know wisdom and to see the task which has been done on the earth, even though one should never sleep day or night, and I saw every work of God, I concluded that man cannot discover the work which has been done under the sun. Even though man should seek laboriously, he will not discover. And though the wise man should say, I know, he cannot discover. So what is the advice that Solomon leaves us with? What's the divine advice that God leaves us with? Fear God. Trust in God, and you won't be afraid of man. It was Jesus that said, don't be afraid of the man that can kill the body. Fear the one that can destroy both body and soul in hell. God has given us his word. He has promised us, and he has shown us in our own lives that when we let go and let God, he is in control, and our lives are much better. That's the final message of Ecclesiastes chapter 8. Ecclesiastes 6 verse 12, for who knows what is good for a man during his lifetime, during the few years of his futile life, he will spend them like a shadow. For who can tell a man what will be after him under the sun? Nobody.
But this question of fear, we're all afraid of it. And there are things in relationship to this fear that you and I have to recognize. That if you trust in God and let him be your guide and strength, you won't have that fear. And your fear is in relationship to your trust. As your faith in God gets stronger, your fear dissipates. And as your faith in God gets weaker, your fear arises. You want to have fear dissipated and removed, then you rise up and hold up the name of the living God and look to him to undertake for you, and he will. It's our faith that brings victory. It's our faith that casts out fear and enables us to put our trust in the blessed Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. We will worship the man of Galilee who went to a cross 2,000 years ago, and no one can take his place. No one will intercede or interfere. We will not permit it. So it is we have faith without fear.